Mr. Mayor, members of City Council, David Belmer, Director of Planning and Building, will present the item this evening.
Mayor, members of the council, we have a very brief PowerPoint that provides an overview of this agenda item. This is something that we collaborate on with the Department of Community and Economic Development, so we're joined this evening by John Woodhead and Jonathan Brago, our Planning Services Manager. Really quickly, just a very quick overview of what the housing element is. Essentially, it's our long-term planning document that guides our housing activities in the city of Anaheim, both affordable and non-affordable. One of the things that makes it a unique element to our general plan is it's actually reviewed by the state, must be certified by the state. That differentiates it from things like our circulation element and our green space and open space element. And that is an iterative process that we engage in when we prepare the housing element. And we did that last in 2014. So the current housing element that we're in goes from 2014 to 2021. It was done through pretty extensive community outreach with the people of Anaheim. So essentially the community helped us build the goals and objectives that are set forth in our housing element. We're a little bit unique too in that we're a charter city. So we're actually not technically required to do an annual review, but we do it proactively because it assists our efforts to secure certain grant funding in the state that's proved to be beneficial to the city of Anaheim. I mentioned the state. They're not the only agency with whom we deal with in preparing our housing element. SCAG, who is a regional planning agency, is very heavily involved in the preparation of our housing element, most specifically with what's called the RHNA, which is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. Essentially what happens is the city of Anaheim, like every city, gets prescribed a housing goal, a certain number of units that must be either zoned for, provided for in that planning period, that 8-year period. We're actually not required to build that number of units. It's a goal, but we're definitely, as part of our housing element, required to demonstrate that we have sufficient sites with suitable zoning to potentially deliver the housing goal that is set forth by the RHNA obligation. And we have a table that is in your staff report, and this table summarizes that. The column on the left shows our RHNA allocation over the 8-year planning cycle. And you can see there's 5 categories there in general, 4. One is very low, second is low, moderate, and above moderate. Together, you can see we have a goal of 5,702 units that must be ideally provided for over that 8-year planning cycle. Perhaps more importantly, though, with what we're doing here in Anaheim is what's called the quantified objective, which is the column to the immediate right, which shows how many units we told SCAG we think we could actually and practically deliver in that 8-year planning cycle within those categories. And as you can see, we had an obligation of 5,700. We thought we could deliver 4,358. And if you follow the table over, you'll see in certain categories, like the above moderate, we've already exceeded it. We have a surplus of 1,256. And in the income qualified categories of very low, low, and moderate, you can see we've made significant progress. Certainly in the very low category, we have a quantified objective of 83, and we've provided 79. In the low, we have a quantified objective of 367. We're at 111, and the moderate, it's 36, and we're at 45. So we've exceeded that obligation. So how do we do affordable housing? We've had some conversations recently with you as a council about some of the challenges and difficulties of providing affordable housing. We need partners to do it. We don't build it ourselves, and it requires funding. And those efforts are guided directly by Mr. Woodhead and his staff. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thank you, David. Again, this goes towards why is our quantified objective much less than what our RHNA numbers are showing, and it goes towards what is practically possible for you guys to accomplish given the fact that you have limited funding. And in particular, the biggest hit that we've taken in the last 5 years has been the loss of redevelopment money. We had a requirement to set aside 30% of our tax increment into our low mod housing fund to produce affordable housing. That was about $14 million in 2010, 2011. That's gone. There has been no income stream to replace that. So a big chunk of money that we had in which we sought to satisfy those objectives has disappeared. In addition, we've had significant cuts in our CDBG and home programs, our federal programs, that again, you may remember the sequester way back when, but we've had significant decreases in the funding available there. And just a heads up, the Trump administration, their budget is proposing to do away completely with those two sources of funds. So that's created quite a challenge for us. Notwithstanding that,
What's the proposed cut, John? I'm sorry.
the proposed cut is to eliminate,
No, but the quantity of the cut, what's the amount they're looking to,
it's several $1 million on an annual basis.
several million,
Several million.
in terms of the impact on us?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So in 2016, kind of a fluke of the calendar, we don't have the numbers that we had in 2015 and 2014 just because of the way building permits were pulled. But I did want to highlight the fact that we were able to complete the Rockwood Apartments on Lincoln on Lincoln Boulevard. That's 70 units. And we have done several, and you have approved several conduit bond financings where we have been able to extend the affordability of existing apartment complexes and put in substantial monies towards the rehabilitation of those units. So our current efforts, where we're kind of focusing now, given some of our limited resources, we're looking at acquisitions on beach. In particular, we're very interested in the Americana and all the properties around there. We're still involved with our partners at the Related Company in the Avon, Dakota neighborhood. We've recently been able to acquire another unit. We probably have enough critical mass to do another tax credit phase there, and we continue to address that neighborhood. In addition, we're very close to being able to bring forward to you the acquisition of the Sandman Motel. That's right next to Rockwood, and we're looking at a potential 54-unit senior housing project there. Finally, we're interested in doing a homeless veterans housing project, and we are very close to bringing in the two parties that are the major players in Orange County and Southern California, and getting together with them, seeing if we can't work a partnership. If not, we'll be bringing an RFP for their consideration. And with that, I think that concludes our presentation.
Councilmember Barnes.
I noticed in the presentation you don't have zip codes for the areas that you planned these, whether that was low income or very low income housing, and it really concerned me because if this is an ongoing project for 8 years, I would like to have seen at least the presentation, where you started, where were you going to implement those, and then where it would go from there. I did look up the areas of the Rockwood and other areas that you had talked about.
Ms. Barnes, we appreciate those comments, and I think Dr. Moreno at a previous council meeting asked that we look at a more holistic evaluation of where our affordable housing units are they ownership, rental, broken down.
Right.
It just so happened, if you'll recollect, we had this scheduled to come forth with the RENA. Mr. Woodhead and his staff have prepared an informational memo with maps to show where all of our units have been developed, and whether they're ownership or for sale, and better descriptions. But we didn't have it in time for tonight's agenda item. So we'll be providing that to you via mail or via interoffice memo, and we can still talk about the potential, if there's interest in the council, of having a workshop on terms of the strategies moving forward as it relates to affordable housing.
Yeah, I appreciate that, especially because I believe other colleagues, Councilmember Moreno, were very concerned that people are asking for more low-income housing, but I looked at the rents on some of those, and they were just like, wow, how do you even qualify for that? And that's now in 2017. So with that report, could you please show the rent for what those are going for and how? I know you have to qualify to be in there, but then how do you substantiate when you look at the rent that they're asking for?
Well, a lot of what's happening is we're actually subsidizing the rent that is paid by the tenants. And so while, for instance, our Section 8 program, the landlord is receiving market rate rent, but there's a cap on what the tenants are going to pay with their vouchers. That's capped at 30% of their income. So while the landlord in the private sector, they're receiving fair market value, whatever those rents that you view as rather high, sometimes exorbitant, they will get that, but that is not the cost to the tenant. It's much, much less than that.
Does that apply to senior housing also? Because one of the units was strictly senior housing.
It does for any of the units that we have, or any of the projects that we have been involved with on a contractual basis.
But could you show some of that in your presentation next time, just so I know?
I
I'm
absolutely
talking-
will. We'll show you where all of these units are located across the entire city.
Okay, great.
Mr. Mayor, question?
Councilmember Murray.
Thank you. Mr. Belmer, Mr. Woodhead, and Jonathan and Mr. Emery, everybody. I wanted to also, when we bring back the larger scope on the discussion, a greater discussion about some of the constraints that are being put in place by the state, starting with the conclusion of redevelopment, which prohibited or limited and eliminated our ability to help buy down the cost of very expensive land that exists in Southern California to build affordable housing. And now the state is looking at promulgating rules that will make it almost impossible to build new housing of any capacity. So we would need to better understand what those are and how the city can weigh in with a position on that, particularly the rules that are being promulgated from SB 743, which require a VMT, a vehicle miles traveled element to every new housing unit. You have to be able to prove a 40% reduction in VMT as you build new housing. So when we have affordable housing being used by multiple families in order to save money, that is an increase in vehicle miles by those units. And so we have significant constraints on us, and I think as a city we need to be an effective voice in helping the state come to a more rational conclusion when we are literally suffering from one of the worst housing crises since the end of World War II in the state of California, but particularly Southern California. Thank you.
Very good. Councilmember Fessel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Woodhead, going back to the graph, Table 1 on the staff report. God, this takes me back to my planning commissioner days. We used to touch these things back then. The remaining RENA allocation, 5 years to complete. Is it really 5 years to complete? I mean, is there teeth to this? This is a recommendation. Remind me how this worked.
I think there's a recognition with HCD in the state that the RENA numbers are not attainable for just about any city up and down the state. And so that's, again, why we focus on the quantitative objective. Yes, everybody's been allocated all of this housing, and there's a shortage up and down the state, and this is what it would take to rectify that shortage, but we realize that it isn't realistic to think that that's going to happen in this short period of time. So we actually have to send our quantitative objective up to the state for their approval. So, I mean, they've bought off on these numbers. So as far as yeah, I think that's something that we view is attainable within 5 years.
Mr. Mayor, may I have a follow-up question, please? John, so what do we say to our residents who are very concerned of the very low, our very low income up to 50% of the MFI that we've attained, or put 79 permits together in the last 3 years. And of course, most of our conversations today, every council meeting seems to be on the issue that homelessness begins with a home, and our objective should be more, very low income housing. What do we? I mean, should this become a greater focus for us? Maybe it's more rhetorical.
No, it's a good question. We've been following a policy where we are targeting our limited resources at some of our neighborhoods where we have deteriorating and overcrowded housing stock, and the units are not affordable. And so we go in over time, a la Jeffrey Lynn, Avon, Dakota, and we acquire at an arm's length negotiation units. And when we have enough of these units acquired, we bring in our partners, in this instance the Related Group, and we do a tax credit deal, and that targets the very low income households. So we'll make that number pretty easily. If we do the next phase with Related in Avon, Dakota, we will have satisfied that and then some.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Marino.
Thank you for this. I do have a couple of questions, and then, of course, I think I was asked last meeting to make sure that in this part of the meeting to remind you that I'd like it agendized around what we can't talk about, because this is a look back. And so tonight's not the night to look at looking forward. So that's what I was asked to agendize, so please remind me to remind you to agendize that. And I appreciate these numbers, because I think that what these numbers suggest pretty strongly is that there has been an interest by staff and previous councils to meet a housing need in the city. And as you mentioned, redevelopment has kept us from perhaps attaining those goals. What it strongly suggests, based on what you've said over the last several meetings, is that we're in a situation where the market cannot solve our housing crisis as it exists in Anaheim. The market, left to its own devices, is not allowing us to create housing for low-income people. Is that fair to say?
I think it's across the board. I mean, if you look at what the RENA numbers are, yeah, I think it's definitely across the board. You've got a problem. The private sector just isn't building enough housing in California to satisfy the need. Hence, we have a housing crisis at all income levels, but particularly affected are the lower income groups.
Right. So taking out the intervention by the state to the market to entice, to incentivize the building of low-income affordable housing, absent that, the only housing we'll see developed is market rate housing, which is what we're seeing now. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say that any of the housing that is going towards low-income families and those making less than low income is some form of subsidized housing, be it federal tax credits, state tax credits in a bond deal, or be it us throwing in our home funds and CDBG and those sorts of things.
So what I'm hearing is that, yes, there has to be an intervention by an entity, be it local government, federal government, that allows low-income people to be able to access market rate apartments or homes, or to build affordable housing from the get-go.
That's correct.
So my question, which is what's been the ongoing, I think what keeps me just focused on this, and so I appreciate all the information you provided, is I would like to know, if you have any information now, since redevelopment, have there been any others, since redevelopment was abolished, have there been any other cities, be it in our county or statewide, where we've seen actual increased affordable housing development?
I haven't done any research, and I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
But it's certainly something I'll take a look at.
Please, because I'd like to learn if everyone's on equal footing now, redevelopment's gone, is there a municipality that has successfully been able to build or increase its affordable housing stock? I think we're one example where you said we rehab buildings, but are there others that have developed new developments, and how have they worked with developers to then build those units? And within that, so if we get those examples, and then what policies you would suggest that our city needs to think about, a buffet of policy options that we as a council should think about, because it's pretty clear that leaving the market on its own is just going to put us in a deeper crisis as it relates to homelessness, as it relates to what was mentioned at the last meeting, 30,000 people, I think Linda Linkernig said, 30,000 people are one paycheck away from being homeless. So that's something that we really have to think about in terms of the housing stock itself. So I really appreciate your efforts on this. Last question, Mayor, is, and this is kind of unfair because I just learned about this as, through a resident. SB 2, I mentioned this to John just before the meeting, Dave, so I gave you about 3 hours prep time. SB 2 does say, because item strategy 1L in our housing element says it's the development of emergency shelters, transitional and supportive housing in compliance with SB 2. So by state law, we have to develop transitional housing, or at least prepare for that, right?
State law, we have to have, by state law, we have to adopt an ordinance that complies with SB 2.
Right.
And we've done that. And Mr. Brego was heavily involved in that. We can elaborate if you'd like. But we do have an SB 2 ordinance, and it complies with state law.
Yes.
It doesn't require production of units. It essentially says we have to have provisions in zoning infrastructure that allows those that are proposing those uses to be able to have those uses considered,
Okay.
consistent with any other residential use. So there's limitations, really what it is limitation in our ability to prohibit those uses.
Right. So thank you for that, because that's actually very clear in the matrix. So what I'd like to ask is when you come back to talk to us about a plan, I would like us to have a plan. Have we identified spaces around the city where we would be able to implement the compliance measures of SB 2? Where might we think about other emergency or transitional shelters? If the county says, here's some money, if you provide us a building or if you provide us a space, here's some money where Anaheim, you can provide some housing or transitional housing for homeless individuals in Anaheim. So I'm assuming we don't have that based on some of your responses, but if we can have some thinking around that for the next meeting or the next time that you come visit us.
Okay. Councilman Fessel?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One last question. I think that limits me to 3.
Quick one.
Can we also, following up with Councilmember Moreno, can we also get a comparison where Anaheim is, maybe with some of the other cities in Orange County, in some of the RENA numbers and their achievements versus our achievements?
If I might jump in, we certainly can. Our next council meeting is 2 weeks, and now we've got a number of issues that you've raised, that council's raised, that we will do our absolute best to get it agendized. I would like to have concurrence that if we're unable to complete all the requests for information, that we given the opportunity to go to the second meeting in April, and perhaps even a workshop, if not an action item in the evening agenda.
Very good. Okay. Ready for a vote? We have a motion.
Motion to approve.
Motion by Councilmember Kring, second by Councilmember Murray. Roll call. Councilmember, wait, before Councilmember or Mayor Pro Tem Vanderbilt, any questions or comments?
No, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Roll call vote.
Great. Mayor Tate Revote.
Aye.
Councilmember Murray. Councilmember Kring. Councilmember Moreno.
Yes.
Councilmember Barnes.
Yes.
Councilmember Fessel.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Vanderbilt.
Aye.
The vote is 7 ayes, no nays. The motion carries.